Live. Started recording now. Welcome to the Max and Vernon Project. You just missed our very engaging discussion. As we had been raffling off, we've had a lot of submissions for guests as who should be on our show. And we were going through them all, and we appreciate the resumes that were sent in. The boxes of chocolates were wonderful. I enjoyed the caramel truffles. But there's no need, because it doesn't matter if you try hedging your bets. We are going to go with someone probably totally random based on availability. It probably won't even be anything based on who's available. Is basically going to how it works.
It's who is available to do this, that is willing to donate their time to a complete fiasco of a podcast.
Yeah, we cannot even guarantee that it will be uploaded. We had some debacles last time where I ended up having to screen record the entire previous podcast because my computer went down. I'm not really sure what happened, but it actually doesn't sound that horrible. So I appreciate you guys sticking with us. And speaking of that, Vernon, if you don't notice, his voice is a little smoother today.
It's this new microphone I got here. Testes 1 2, testes 1 2.
And we're trying her out, and honestly, I'm not even sure if it's plugged in now that I hear it. So we'll find out here as we go through, and if it doesn't work, we'll make it work. So bear with us. This is basically everyone's support has so far gotten us a microphone.
Yeah, that's a big step, my friend. Amazon Prime come through in the clutch.
It is on, by the way. I can hear it.
Testes.
Sounds wonderful. All right, well, you know what, Vern? I'm weird. You know that. Surprise.
So this is starting out good, huh?
This is how it's going to start. I was reading, another surprise, a book this weekend about the brain and the nervous system, and I was actually reading about acetylcholine formation. Now, I texted Vernon ahead of time. I was going to talk about this, and I didn't give him any context because, sorry, Vernon, too bad. I was going to talk about it.
That's how this rolls.
And yeah, this is. And so it's a basically, I was looking at acetylcholine is what crosses the neuromuscular junction into the muscle, which causes it to contract, right? And that's how we learned it in, physiology. Oh, you have the vesicles that are sent from the neuromuscular junction, and it is then, received by the muscle and it contracts. But then I read about the science of it, and my mind was blown because I felt cheated. There's so much more to it that wasn't brought to my attention. And I felt shafted in a way that I wanted give me my money back. Someone owes me something here. So long story short, the mitochondria is where acetyl-CoA comes from. It's coenzyme A, and that binds with choline to make hence acetylcholine. So your mitochondria at the neuromuscular junction are what make essentially, or the precursors to your vesicles that are acetylcholine that eventually cross the synaptic cleft to cause this, the muscle contraction. But then when it binds to the muscle, there's all these different types of receptors on that side. There's nicotinic, and it's all under the cholinergic system, nicotinic and muscarinic. And there's different subtypes of receptors, and these receptors can become desensitized to an extent. And then you start thinking about mitochondria and how, if something goes wrong to the mitochondria, maybe acetylcholine goes poorly. And there's actually theories about how that happens with aging and how eventually that leads to the neuromuscular junction moving away and de-innervating from the fiber itself. And it got me thinking. And I was like, wow, this is really cool. Because then my brain starts to churn. Oh, what's wrong with it? This is so neat. And I couldn't stop reading about it. And first off, I was kind of mad. I was like, why didn't I know this earlier? And then secondly, my brain goes to, well, what are all the nutritional factors that could go into making sure my mitochondria work better? And then I thought, well, your mitochondria are specific at this neuromuscular junction. And then if you don't use that neuromuscular junction as much, well, the mitochondria might not be as useful. And I was thinking about this as I was doing some depth jumps the other day, because then I was using my stretch reflex and I was like, well, my goodness, well, maybe those muscles, sorry, not those muscles, but those nerves that are involved there obviously have mitochondria in it. And the more we use those nerves, theoretically, the more we use it, the better it gets. And so in principle, I have validated my own reason as to why I'm lazy in training and do the same thing every day, because I'm just working on those neural pathways, obviously. But the point is, what I was trying to get at was
What are you trying to get at?
it was so cool. There's so much more to what we do from a movement standpoint than what we think we know. And I will get to the answer of this, I promise. But the idea was that there's all this stuff that's happening. It's like, wow, look at all these, chemical things and molecular aspects that we don't necessarily elucidate. And it made me think about how we then try to summarize this up in like a single catchphrase, and that then relates to training, i.e., all these fancy chemical things happen and, molecular aspects. And then we say, you need to build a foundation, so get stronger. And I'm like, well, I think we're leaving it kind of short there.
Yeah, I guess that when you elaborate like that, I mean, there's a lot more room to explore there. And I think it kind of goes with, like you said, we were texting yesterday and you were talking about learning, and you were talking about, I mean, I'll let you quote it, but it was, you said, what we thought we knew and how we learned. And I think it kind of goes with that, I guess you would say.
Yeah. The more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. And that's actually where the quote, I didn't think of that quote, but where that quote resonated with me when I was reading that. And it's interesting because when you zoom out really far and you think about movement and how we exercise, well, there's a lot of things we can explore in that realm. But then we go a next dimension lower at, like, say, the muscles and the bones. And some people love fascia and they want to talk about, fascia and trigger points all day. Cool. And then you can go even deeper as to, the molecular aspects of a neuromuscular junction and how things are formed. But what happens is I think we like to live on one of these planes the whole time. We don't like to go above and below planes. If you're, you like to stay in the fascia realm and that's maybe your thing. And some people like to stay only in the exercise realm. And I think it's good for us to kind of go up and down these different dimensions and planes for us to understand the human body a little more.
Oh yeah, and it's that, like you said, I think you said the magic word, zoom. Being able to zoom in and zoom out and really find out, the impact on, the physiology that you are, interpreting and that you are trying to apply to an athlete or yourself for that matter, like you were talking about, and being able to understand a little bit deeper. I kind of parlay that back to mobility and stuff when people are trying to address tissue and they never really address what's going on in the actual joint. If you're always starting distal, so like distal towards the exercise, you don't really know where the problem or where your mistake or misstep is occurring. So it's best to understand, the proximal and the distal to be able to work in and work out. I think that's kind of a good interplay of kind of what you're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's okay to have things of interest in certain realms, right? You're allowed to want to focus your time on movement. Maybe it's even more of a macro view and you like to focus your time on how people communicate. And it's even like beyond that of exercise, it's another level up. And it's okay to have, different planes and areas you like to sit in. But I think it's important for us too to go up and below these planes. And the reason why I say that is because if we get stuck on a certain plane and start thinking about only movement, only exercises, then we kind of miss some of these unique aspects that can help us explain the why. Because unless you understand the how things work, you don't actually understand the why things work. And that's a big difference. For example, someone can say, well, I want to develop power, like classic, or I want to get faster. And you say, okay, well, you can do speed squats because they're at a velocity that is closer to that of sprinting, right? So that's the why. But the how it works is not explained by the why. The how might be, well, it helps with motor learning in the brain and helps with the neuromuscular junction, like I just mentioned. And if we understand the how, we can understand how other variables influence it. So if we don't understand the how of motor learning, right? Like it's something, it helps motor learning. Well, then if we do understand that, we can realize that maybe sleep and lack of sleep can actually disrupt motor learning. And so now we can say, look, if I have highly complex exercises that day that are neurologically demanding from a skill standpoint, maybe the person who didn't sleep that much the day before do those because they can't acquire the skills in a way and then store them and retrieve them in the future. Just like maybe that night of sleep they slept poorly, they might need to go through the skill session again. And so it really kind of opens up the door to this unique area of exploration, moving up and down planes, but also then left and right through different kind of fields.
I think that's an interesting point because when you say, honestly, when you go back to that, what I guess you would say that beginning point or zooming all the way in or to that bottom layer that you're talking about, it allows you to understand maybe more of that dynamic system, that how everything relies on everything and that cognitive load and the nervous system demand on things rather than just thinking about the top layer or the exercise or what you visibly can see when there's a lot of invisible things to the naked eye that are going on that impact that. And I think that's kind of funny because what the information that we rely on our athletes to give to us, how much sleep did they have? Did they eat breakfast? Did they eat lunch? Did they, all these things, what tests do you have? What did you guys do in practice yesterday? We're relying on them to give us reliable information, valid information. And if we don't even understand the physiological adaptations that we're trying to instill on an athlete, we're assuming now not only that the athlete's communicating what they say they are, but also we're assuming that they're even prepared or ready for the stressor that we're about to apply.
Mm-hmm. And then, so let's think about the sleep example, right? Because sleep isn't just stuck at how much you sleep, but what kind of sleep do you get? Are you getting a lot of deep sleep? Are you getting a lot of REM sleep? Are you waking up quite a bit? How many cycles? So people go, oh, well, how much did you sleep? But if you look at it, that's different because deep sleep is what we like to think about in terms of our physiological adaptive capacity to sleep, our body's ability to recover from sleep itself. But then you might have something like REM sleep, which some argue actually has a response for emotional adaptation. And that is your ability to regulate, say, your memories of that day or some of your emotions without your amygdala being involved in it. So it desensitizes what is your knee-jerk reaction. And so when I say that, then all of a sudden you now bring up things like, oh, different brain centers. Like, what's the amygdala do? And now, it opens up the door to the interconnectivity of it. But I think we do ourselves a little bit of a disservice, at least from explorers of information, that we try to only simplify it. Because we need to expand and then simplify and then expand and simplify and kind of acting like this sinusoidal wave that goes compresses and expands, because that helps us then consolidate and then search out.
But at the same time, I guess the double-edged sword of that, Max, would be at what point is it okay to simplify? Because when you think about young strength coaches or young, just people that are in college, young students, it has to be somewhat simple for them to get their feet underneath them. It's almost like, putting them in the shallow end before you put them in the deep end. But there has to be that transition. And I think it relies on a lot of coaches to personally do it because the actual structured educational system does not really push a young student or a young coach or a young fitness professional, whatever the capacity is, to dive deeper. It's very surface level information. So then it requires the person to have that want to acquire that information to become more well versed in it so that they can dive deeper, like you're saying.
Absolutely. And so I think that I like to use the term appreciation versus application. So you need to do our best to appreciate and dive deep into it, but that doesn't mean you have to always apply it. And I think that's a big difference because the application by nature typically occurs at a more zoomed out level, right? Because you're working with multiple people. You're working with not just, one athlete, but maybe 20 or 25. And so the application has to start to fit the bell curve. On average, what is going to help the majority of my athletes. And so that's where the application comes in. But the appreciation is that if I respect that my application is only percentile effective, maybe only, 75% of my athletes get the best outcome of what I'm offering, then my appreciation recognizes if those other 25% don't adapt, maybe I can find a way to simply apply something new in that setting that gets that last little bit over the edge. And so that's kind of, again, zooming in, zooming out, zooming in, zooming out, fits in.
So when it comes to, I guess, your athletes, Max, and your preparing their readiness, or you're asking these questions for these, the athletes that you're working with, or yourself, I guess you would say, how do you do that evaluation? How are you starting from that ground zero that you're talking about, but then communicating that to the athletes so that you can progress from that ground zero starting point to get to that surface level? Because obviously you have to do exercises. So how do you get across that path?
I'm in a massively spoiled situation where I get to work a lot of one-on-one. And so it's not always going to be directly applicable to that of a team setting. Let's not be naive.
Yeah.
Right? I'm not going to sit here on a pedestal and say, oh, everyone needs to know everything. All right. I look at myself as much as an educator and someone who wants to make people excited about learning as much as I'm a realist, because I'm the same person who, if someone comes in and they're like, yo, Max, I just want to crush me today. Let's go really hard. Play some AC/DC. Let's bench press.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Let's do it. Because ultimately, if first off, I am, their trainer, they pay for me. So I should probably do what they kind of want to do. It's kind of how a private setting typically works. And someone doesn't like an exercise, I'm not going to make them do it. But then from an educational standpoint, I want to hold myself accountable to know these type of things, because if my role then changes to more of an educator position, whatever it might be, well, I should be able to showcase how, the real world versus, I don't want to call it real versus research. That's a bad way to put it, but it's like application versus appreciation, because then what you can do on yourself can take it to another level. And it's always resource based, in my opinion, too. So certain teams and settings might have more resources that allow you to go to another level. I always think about the more zoomed in you get, it's almost like a multiplier of 2 or 3 in the resource realm, right? If you have one coach and you got 30 people, you have to be at plane 1. You don't have the resources. It's not reasonable. But as you go into it deeper, another plane, well, maybe you have assistant coaches. Some places have statisticians that work on their staff. Some people have a head doc, a statistician, a phlebotomist, a registered dietitian, and 4 strength coaches, right? All of a sudden, the resources are very different. And so let's think about it in terms of planes, but that doesn't mean from a scientific standpoint, we can't, as pursuers of knowledge, want to learn more.
Yeah. And I think when you say getting deeper, being able to zoom out, and that multiplier, I think that exists on the deeper you can understand something, the more multiplied you can get moving out. When you truly understand what you're seeking and the adaptation that you're chasing and what you're truly trying to, impart on a human, you can really bounce out from that. You can really understand the impact that you're having because you understand what's going on from that ground zero area.
Absolutely. And when I think about like diving in deep, I think about it in terms of like, okay, I'm trying to be less wrong. So I'm diving into something. And what I dive into might not be a solution. It might not even influence the current solution I use to my problem. For example, I might dive really deep and understand all these intricate nutritional factors and aspects. However, though, if I want to, I can theorize as to why that might influence a body, someone's, performance. But from an application standpoint, it might become super minor. A great example of that is like tendon neuroplastic training. It's a great word, by the way. Dr. Ebony Rio is like one of the forefronts on it. And she brought up to the point that when we have tendon injuries, it could actually be a brain issue. It could be the brain isn't communicating properly to the tendon, and we have issues in regards to the motor drive from the cortex. Now, that has a lot of detail into it, right? It talks about neuroplasticity, which is we need to understand how neuroplasticity works. We got to understand how the brain works. We got to understand all these complex things. But at the end of the day, the simple solution they provided was to do isometrics to a metronome that you are really focused on. It's like a really simple thing, but it comes from the higher region of interest. So like, or I guess deeper level, but higher complexity.
Well, and I think when you also understand those smaller things, those smaller micro things that you're talking about, it may allow you to understand the macro things better. So just someone simply reading that and understanding that maybe slightly, it might be pretty complicated, but at the same or complex, but them reading that, they may be like, oh, wow, I never understood how much the brain mattered with something like this. So now that maybe they start to look at the nervous system different, where they understand, okay, now fatigue may be a big problem with some sort of high-end plyometrics that I'm going to go do that day. Just from understanding that that quick deep dive, that shallow deep dive that they did, and then they come up for air, and now they're like, oh, maybe they're not thinking about it from that perspective, but now they're thinking about it as, oh, now I'm able to connect these dots a little bit better. Now I understand, like, oh, there's a lot more at play than just me prescribing exercises as once I previously thought.
Absolutely. And I think in conjunction with that, part of it is that when we're diving into something complex like the body, it's easy to be fooled by someone who's adamant in information. For example, like, oh, this sounds so unique. Let's, it must be right. Like the ooh and ah of the nervous system is my favorite thing. Like for some reason, it has this like mystic thing surrounding it, like, ooh, the nervous system, and like as if it's not, first off, a tangible thing. Like the nervous system has physical structure in your body. It's not electrical impulses just propagating arbitrarily throughout it, and it's like chi just everywhere. I mean, it's not. No, there's a little more definition to it. And then we say things like, oh, that's neuromuscular. But you're like, well, everything's neuromuscular because if I move my muscle, it's in the nervous system. And then we can say things, oh, it's a nervous system adaptation. And I go, well, what the hell does that mean? Does that mean it's at the neuromuscular junction? Is it movement of the mitochondria itself? Is it a physical change in the nerve? Is it the motor nerve? Is it the intermotor neurons, the one at the spinal cord? Is it the motor cortex of the brain? Is it a higher brain center and how that functional connectivity works within it? Please tell me more, because your arbitrary classification of it's a nervous system issue is a similar thing to saying, oh, it's a muscle issue, but let's not say what muscle. It's a muscle thing. Tell me more, please.
It is definitely it depends answer. It's almost been something that's kind of been casted over of, oh, that's the nervous system. You're like, well, like you said, what part, what are we talking about here? You just can't throw that word out all willy-nilly and then just be like, it's the nervous system. What does that even mean? But it's something that I think we've almost gravitated towards as a profession, because it's easier to speak about the body in reductionist theory and dumbing everything down and comparing it to like a car or a computer, because when we truly dive in, it is anything but that. It is not an assembly line. It is not one thing does this and then one thing does that. It is not like, oh, well, your brain is the hard drive, and then the random access memory is this, and then your mouse is your limbs. No, not at all. Like I can take my phone and click on my Safari, and it's not going to open up my calculator. But with an athlete or myself, you could press one button or touch one spot or have them do one exercise, and it may open up something that you were not prepared for. There's multiple inputs, or there's multiple outputs for multiple inputs, whereas hardware, a computer, a car, there's one output for one input.
Well, even the computer example, I laugh at times, because the great examples, like your muscles, the engine, and your nervous system, the chip that runs it, right? Yeah. Honestly, microprocessors are pretty fucking confusing. Okay, they're in a computer chip, so please tell me how that's simple. Like, just because I made it sound simple does not mean it is simple. Have you ever looked at a computer chip? Because those things don't make any damn sense to me. And there are structural changes in it. So the fact that we try to use a simple model, a computer chip, and an engine, we actually just brought about something that's highly confusing, because you just brought up combustion physics, like the physics of combustion that an internal combustion engine is pretty amazing. And then we also talk about all the sensories. If you look at, I watched that Formula One show on Netflix, and it's like there's like 95 people watching the computer of a race car. If you thought a car was a simple thing, it's not. So like it's the irony of it, right? It's a simple analogy, but people just leave it at that. But if you actually dive into the analogy, it's actually really complex. Like, for sure, microprocessors use quantum physics.
Yeah.
That's how they work. Okay, I don't even understand it.
I have no idea. Doesn't understand it. Max doesn't understand it. Oh my God!
But I have a quantum mechanics book on my desk that has been turned and has brought about no information to me.
Of course you do. You're the only person. But you're exactly right. It's how we identify. I remember I heard a person one time say, draw a bike, and they drew a bike on the board, and then everyone that was in the presentation drew a bike, and it was, how do you perceive what a bike looks like? And it was the same thing kind of that he was getting at with like the reductionist theory of talking about the body, was our perception of how complex a bike is perceives how we perceive that complexity of, the bike itself and how we think about it.
Yeah, and part of that kind of drives me crazy. People go, the rebuttals. Well, Max, what are you going to do with this information? Right? What are you going to do with knowing more? Well, did you hear yourself? What are you going to do with knowing more? I hope that's your own. It isn't that what you want to learn about. Isn't that you're inclined to be more knowledgeable on the topic that is your profession? So that's an ironic statement as it is, right? What are you going to do with all this new information, Max? Well, what are you going to do with it, right? I'll do it with what I do with it. What would you do with it? And that's the thing that kind of drives me crazy is people go, oh, Max, that information's not applicable. You're just going to get lost in the weeds down there. Oh, okay, I hope I get lost in the weeds going down in the profession I like. So like, okay, I'm going to try and learn more about how the human body works. Oh, how dare you? Like, how dare you make it confusing?
I think also a lot goes to that with ego. Like people don't want to know that maybe they don't know, which is what I saw you post about on social media. You texted me the other day. It's people don't want to know that they don't know. And I think it's like refreshing. I think it's mildly refreshing. I mean, half the damn time I hear you talk, Max, I'm like, holy shit. Like, why didn't I think of that? Or, I need to look more into this. And it's almost, it invigorates me. It makes me want to learn more, to know more, because I almost feel like left out, like when I don't know that. But I also know coaches that don't want to know that. They don't want to know more because they're very comfortable where they're at. They're happy where they're at. It's just comfortable. And I think it's funny because that's the same paradoxical statement we make to athletes about wanting them to know more. Don't you want to know more about your sport? Don't you want to practice more? Don't you want to watch more tape? And it's like, don't you as a coach want to know more? Don't you want to watch more tape? Don't you want to read more?
I guess the only thing you risk by trying to know more is you realize that what you were doing is wrong. Like that's the only risk you run.
For sure.
Is if not that what you're doing is wrong, but you now know what you're doing is wrong. Because what you're doing currently may be right or wrong in the universe of it, but once you discover it, then you're held accountable to your it. So
I like that feeling though. I like that, but I think that comes with, like you said, by not being a certain guy. Like if you're only a fascia guy and this is the only way the fascia works, then you've put your flag in the sand on the fascia, and it's hard to pull your flag up when you're locked in on that. And I think once you open yourself up to being an avid learner, a continuous learner, as Asimov says, like never stop learning, then it's almost like I can pick my flag up and move it any day I want, because all I can do is be the best coach that I can be on the given day of the information that I know. Now, if I learn something tomorrow that changes my perspective on how I train, then I think that's powerful for me as a coach. So when my athletes come in and be like, hey, we have something, we're going to look at it a different way now. Now I want to try this. Now I want to do this. I think as coaches, we think that athletes will look at us and be like, well, why didn't you know that? Whereas I perceive it as, when I've said that to athletes in the past, they've been like, oh, awesome. It's almost like, wow, this is cool. We're trying something new. Oh, this is awesome. Like you're actually applying the things that you're learning.
Mm-hmm. Yes, because there should be no shame in changing, no shame in learning. As a shameful plug for myself, ha ha ha, no pun intended. Whenever I present, unless asked to present on a specific topic or a presentation I've already given because they want it for whatever clinic or they're doing, I refuse to give the same presentation. Because in my opinion, if I give the same presentation on the similar topic, maybe someone in that crowd's already seen that, so I felt bad because they paid money to come see it. But number two, it's like, what am I doing? Like, don't I want to showcase what I have learned, or share, not showcase, but share and maybe bring interest to something that's new? If I've already given a presentation on a topic, I selfishly have no more interest in presenting on it. Like, I'm like, I don't really want to talk about that. And maybe it's myself that's this kind of forever searching for new things and kind of natural ADD of person. But it's like when you read stuff, going back to the initial discussion, you find out you're like, dude, I don't No, like I'm looking at this card right here. What a nerd. I have to pull it to the screen.
Is that a menu? Is that a menu? Oh
It's
no,
an
that's
it's an integrated systems Lippincott illustrated reviews. And in this, there's anatomy, biochemistry, cell and molecular, embryology, genetics, histology, immunology, microbiology, neuroscience, pathology, pathophysiology, pharmacology, and physiology. Like all those topics, I'm like, well, they all influence you. Like, hence the word integrated systems. Like, so when we think about performance, we're so busy stuck on performance physiology, right? We're stuck on that. And if that study didn't say someone jumped higher, that's not a useful study for me if it said that the neuromuscular junction had more mitochondria present. But then you're like, well, first off, dude, no money is going to be actually in doing high-level sports science research because people would rather cure bigger issues. So we get a lot of our information from other things, such as sarcopenia research and how that stuff works because there's more money involved in it. But the point is, what I'm trying to get at is that we as you as a listener, as a learner, should be encouraged to try and do new and unique things that might be challenging your own ideologies that already exist.
Yeah, no different than our previous podcast we talked about of getting out of your echo chamber. It goes with that. And I don't think it has to be this, where do I start? Where do I start? Like, do I need to look up the whole system? Do I need to look up all those topics that you just listed off? No, you just start with one.
Start with one, yes.
Because once you start with one, it's infectious because then you're like, oh my God, this is connected? What the, like, it's almost like, oh my God, like this is connected again, and then now you read another topic, you're like, oh my God, these are connected. And it almost becomes like a domino. And then once those dominoes start falling, you start to realize that everything is connected in that integrative system that you were just mentioning. So it's, where do I start? It's just start with one. Start with something that mildly interests you away from where you're comfortable at. To me, that's somewhere that I like to start. Like if I'm trying to learn something new or something, I don't just dive into something that I'm not interested in or in maybe an avenue that I'm not interested in participating in. Like I'm not the best reader, but maybe I find a topic that I'm interested in. Now I search it on YouTube and it kind of opens up that avenue of learning and opening my mind to it. And now I'm able to dive into a book a lot better because I have somewhat of a foot in the water already.
That's awesomely put because it's true. I don't know how many messages I get. Where do I start? I don't know. It's like the equivocal to being on like the East Coast and you're trying to get to the West Coast and you go, well, where do I start? On the East Coast. I don't know. Okay, somewhere
on the road.
Yeah, there's a lot of places. Pick one. Right? It's not a board game where you go from one progression to the next. It's more like you hit a baseball into a field and it's exactly in the middle. So it's a circle. So no matter at what point you enter, you're going to get to the same spot. So just go into the field and get the ball.
Yeah,
right?
It's not the end point of knowing the knowledge. It's the learning along the way that may stimulate a newer interest that you never even thought you had. And now you're like, oh my God, like I never even thought about behavioral kinesiology this way. I've never even thought that this was important. And now you're traveled down, a path that you never would have even anticipated because you open yourself up to that first out input.
Absolutely. And I guess wrapping it up to summarize this, first off, there's a lot of things that are connected, right? Obviously we talk about that every time, but it's that our diving deeper into things like said neuromuscular junction can be cool because it can help you then theorize how you could apply it at a larger level, which then, for my instance, an example might be like, hey, if I know neurons respond potentially in this one way, then I've taken this integrative neuroscience and then I'm going to make it theoretical, my own, proposition, what I think it might work as, and I apply it to my own training. By the way, you can probably, your own training is a good place to apply it to. We didn't really talk about that much, but maybe our next one will dive into that. That's a great time to explore certain things. Yep. And then from there, you can begin to realize that there's a lot to learn. And then we dive into that whole idea of let's make this fun. Let's make this exciting. Let's make this a discovery process, not a responsibility, and you're now held responsible to your actions that might not have been the best in the world. So what I mean by that, if you now learn that you were not doing the best strength training program previously, doesn't mean you should have repercussions to it just because you have learned something new.
Yeah. And I think as, you know, as professionals in this field, whether that's the private setting, the collegiate setting, whatever it is, you are responsible. You know, someone is putting their health on your plate, and it's something I don't take lightly, and I don't think any of us should. You know, they're trusting you. You don't go to the doctor and just being like, man, I really hope he, you know, I'm not really sure what he's going to say. I really hope. You go to that doctor, and whatever he says, you're going, okay. Like you're nodding your head, like I trust this person. You don't go to the dentist and they say you have a cavity, and you go, nah, I don't think I have one. They're going to do fucking root canal right then, or, you know, schedule you an appointment because you trust what they're saying because they're a professional. So I think we have the responsibility as professionals to start to dive deeper, whether in whatever capacity that it is, to provide the best service for those that are entrusting their health and wellness with us.
Well said. Absolutely. That's why they don't use leeches anymore and they use medication, because they've held their profession to a standard where maybe that leeches didn't have the most scientific backing in the world. And that's a good thing. And so that kind of wraps it up today. If you guys have any comments or questions, feel free to direct message Vernon, not myself. His cell phone is, I'm kidding, I'm not going to give that out. And feel free to give us 5 stars on all things you review us on. Leave very kind, sweet-hearted reviews about how nice Vernon's beard is groomed and things like that. Be excited he got a microphone. We just appreciate you guys listening. By the way, this whole time, Vern has just been housing Moscow mules.
Hey man, it's the evening time. I'm done for the day.
Yeah, that is not a mule. The size of that's a Moscow mountain. The number of that you've had. I didn't realize the kid came in gallon size.
Hey man, I got a backpack for these things, like a super soaker with straws that wrap around.
Yes. All right, guys. Well, we're gonna finish it up here as we did regress. So I appreciate you guys listening. And if you have comments or questions, again, feel free to let us know. We're happy to dive on some specific topics as we go forward here.
Yep. Later, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. Make sure to leave us a review on Apple and Spotify and however else you can leave reviews.
Verbal testimonies. mail in reviews. All right, we're done here. All right, thanks, guys.
Let's cut this thing off.